Hey guys, Nikki here. Today I wanted to talk about IVF and specifically what our first round of IVF was like. Now, if you're not familiar, we are pursuing IVF to avoid genetic issues, not for fertility reasons. If you want the full backstory, head over to my IVF playlist, but let's get started. So when you first are going through IVF, you do some initial consults where they will do things like check how many follicles you have. That basically will tell them how many eggs you have the possibility of producing. It does not guarantee that you will actually produce eggs from all of them. They'll look at other things about your health as well. And when you're actually ready to start IVF, they're going to give you a calendar that tells you a little bit more about the timeline that you can expect roughly for when things will happen, when you might change medications, when you may have an egg retrieval. Now, the tricky part is that schedule is not going to go as planned, almost guaranteed, but it does give you at least some idea of what to expect. I'm going to put mine up on the screen here in case you're curious what mine looked like, but again, I don't know if this is standard or not. My guess is that the date ranges are roughly accurate, but again, they're going to change for everyone based on how your body reacts to the medications. So your cycle really starts with what they call a baseline appointment. This is where they kind of do an initial check of where you're at. I was asked to get my medications before I had my baseline appointment. And I think that's so that if your body is looking ready to, start that day, you're able to do that. I was lucky enough to have IVF insurance through Progeny, and I have a whole video on that if you're curious about what IVF insurance looks like specifically through Progeny, but I think some of it will apply to other providers as well. Progeny allowed me to order my medications through a pharmacy called VFP. They are remote. I think they're based out of Massachusetts, and they basically will overnight you your medications whenever you need them. They were able to give me my first 5 days of medication, as well as my trigger shot and any kind of supplies that I needed. So things like alcohol wipes, syringes, that type of stuff. They also gave me my antibiotics that I would need for transfer day. So basically I had everything for the very end of the cycle on hand as well as the very beginning. And then I was gonna have to call them throughout the cycle to get my updated doses of medication or, just more days worth of it. So I'm gonna give you a quick explanation here of how the medications work. This is from a very much non-medical standpoint. I hope that I don't say anything incorrect. Please let me know in the comments if I did misspeak here, but this is just kind of my rough understanding as someone with no background on it. So during your initial consult, they're gonna count how many follicles you have. And basically you have a bunch of follicles that are all capable of growing eggs. During a normal monthly cycle, you're only going to produce and release 1 to 2 eggs. But again, you have many more than that inside your body. So I actually had 40 that they counted that were capable of producing eggs. So those medications are going to encourage all of those follicles to grow eggs at the same time, while also prevent releasing of those eggs, which is normally when you are ovulating, and that is when they get released into the area where they're able to be fertilized. So when you go to your appointments throughout your IVF cycle, they're going to be doing blood work as well as doing an ultrasound where they're going to count how many eggs are of a certain size. I think they start counting them once they get above 10 millimeters, but they want to see eggs ideally between 18 millimeters and 22 millimeters. Once they get up to be too big, they're kind of over mature, and that's not as good, just like if they're under mature. In my case, with my very first cycle, I actually had 2 follicles that grew very, very quickly. And what my ultrasound tech told me is that often they will sacrifice those couple larger eggs that grow really quickly in favor of getting more eggs a little bit later in your cycle. From what I recall, I think they try to harvest any of the eggs that are above that 15 millimeter mark just in case, but I think 18 to 22 is what I recall being the golden range of what they're aiming for. Now also just note that I have actually done 2 rounds of IVF. I'm filming this kind of way after my first one. I will film a whole other video on my second round because they were very different. And I will just note that my medications started the same with my 2 cycles, but throughout the cycle, they changed a lot. My body reacted very differently each time. So I don't think there's really a true standard of what to expect. Everyone's body reacts differently. And that's why you want to have a good provider who's going to tweak your medications based on whatever your body needs to grow those eggs. All right, so let's get into just what I recall from how the whole round of IVF went, because I had a lot going on in my life at the time, and I'll dig into some of those details here. So at the very beginning of the cycle, I was actually very frustrated. I may pop this video in here, but when I left my baseline appointment, I was actually almost in tears. So I just left my baseline appointment for IVF, and I wanted to film it while it's still raw because I'll be honest, I don't feel like I had the best experience just now. We've been talking to this IVF clinic for a while. We had my kind of meetings with my doctor virtually a while back, and I kind of know what to expect. Like, they walked us through it at some point, but it's definitely been a few months since I've talked to my doctor. And then I've had some conversations with nurses, mostly like over written communication, like messages on the portal. And so I have my calendar and stuff, and my medications arrived this past weekend, but like, I don't feel like I know what to expect fully. So I go in for this baseline thinking they'll walk me through everything. They'll like tell me what time of day to take my meds and all that good stuff. So they have me come in, they do a blood draw, they take my weight, they do an ultrasound for checking my ovaries. And then they're like, okay, well, you'll probably start taking meds on Thursday, depending on how your blood work goes. And I'm like, is that it for this appointment? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, I don't feel like I know what to expect at all. And like, I probably sounded like I was about to cry, because I was about to cry, because I was like, I don't know what's going on. And like, this is an intense process, and it's an expensive process. Even with insurance, it's expensive. And I don't understand why I had to ask someone to walk me through it. Anyway, so I was able to talk to this woman named Nurse Dawn, and she literally walked me through how my medications work, like exactly how to do it. And she was like, you're gonna have a video that will walk you through how to do all this from start to finish, so you can rewind, pause, whatever, but I want to show you, that way you're not feeling clueless. And I was like, that helps a lot, thank you. And I was able to ask her about what time of day to take my meds, and she told me like she recommends doing it like 15 minutes before your normal bedtime. That way if you're out and about, you're not having to like rush and take meds in your purse and like do them in the bathroom, and it's too much. So like, she walked me through that type of stuff, which just made me feel a lot better. But I'll be honest, like, this wasn't the best like first real appointment experience. Like, I just wanted to leave feeling a lot more confident than I do. So I don't know. I don't really know what to expect right now. I hope that I feel better after like I get a couple reps of doing the meds under my belt. But yeah, it's so far it's not exactly what I expected. I think I expected to feel a lot more supported in the whole experience. So when they sent me my calendar that had all of the instructions, the nurse did include like a video that showed how to do those injections. And in hindsight, yes, it walked me through them really well. But at no point during my appointments did anyone offer to kind of show me how everything works. And I was just sitting there in these appointments thinking like, this is like a $28,000-ish procedure thing that I'm going through right now. And no one has asked me like, hey, do the instructions make sense? Like, do you feel ready to kind of start all of this? I literally had to pull someone aside, almost in tears, and ask if there's anyone that could walk me through it. And yes, there was a very kind woman that could, but it wasn't like it was offered to me. I had to seek it out. And maybe this is because I went to a really big clinic. It's very well known in the Atlanta area. I'm not going to share the name publicly here. I don't know. I think sometimes they forget that, well, they deal with this every day. Your patients don't. And I just really wanted some more support, especially right out the gate, because it is a big deal. You don't want to screw it up. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I don't think it is, though. I did not feel good walking out of that baseline appointment at all. So going into the first night of medications, it was interesting because my husband was actually the one that unpacked the box for me and kind of inventoried everything. And we didn't realize until 30 minutes before we were supposed to do my injections that they didn't send alcohol wipes like they were supposed to. Apparently we actually had some at home, but when I was looking for them, I was in such a panic that I just had blinders on and somehow didn't see them. So I had sent my husband out to buy some from like Walmart or whatever was open. Luckily we were able to track some down. It was just kind of a whole nerve-wracking experience. My husband actually did all of my injections for our first round of IVF. I don't know, I probably could have figured it out myself, but it was nice to have my partner there to kind of share in just some of the burden of the whole experience because my body was going to be going through a lot and I was just nervous with all the shots. It was nice to have him kind of be that like steadying force and actually doing the shots for me. So the medications that I took at the beginning of my IVF round were Gonal-F and Menopur. The Gonal-F did not really hurt. The Menopur for me did tend to hurt quite a bit. It kind of depended on the day how much it hurt, but again, that's where it was kind of nice in some ways to have my husband do it because especially with that first round where I didn't really know what to expect, he was just kind of able to focus on just doing it and all I had to do was kind of like cringe and, you know, hold tight and hope that I would be okay. Also, I'm just gonna stand up for a sec. I probably will try to find some videos of my husband doing it, but basically I did my injections somewhere in this whole area, kind of like an inch or two away from my belly button, and that seemed to work pretty well. That was also what my doctor instructed, but I think there are other injection locations that you can do if for some reason the belly doesn't work, but that's a question for your provider, not for me, because obviously I'm not a medical professional. So in terms of the appointments, the way that mine typically went were that I would go into the office early in the morning. They would go in, draw my blood. I don't know exactly what they were testing for with my blood, but I know that they needed to get it every time. And then I would go in and have an ultrasound where they would count how many of my eggs were above that 10 millimeter mark and again, measure each one of those. And as I mentioned earlier, they're aiming for as many as possible between that 18 and 22 mark. So part of why they do those appointments early in the morning is so that they have a little bit of time to analyze your results, and then a nurse will call you generally in the early afternoon, give you an update of where you're at and recommend either like tweaking your medications or leaving them the same. Now for me, because Progeny didn't allow me to keep a lot of medications on hand at any given time, I needed to make sure I reordered by 3 p.m. if I needed to get more meds. I typically got my phone call from my nurse between 1 and 2 p.m. It sounds fine, like that sounds like plenty of time to, you know, call and get those updated prescriptions. But for me, I have a meeting heavy job, so I'm often stacked with like only a couple minutes between meetings my entire day. And so I would have to get on hold with the pharmacy and wait to talk to someone and then get the order and everything updated. And sometimes it was really hard to do that before the cutoff time to get everything shipped the next day. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not a massive inconvenience, but it is something to be aware of depending on what you have going on in your life between that probably 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. mark if you're using an insurance company like Progeny that has some of those like tight rules in place. That whole process was just a little bit more stressful than I anticipated. I'll link this video in the description below, but I do a whole deep dive on my IVF insurance and kind of how it impacted my whole experience. And I think it would be helpful for those of you guys that are going to be going through this with insurance. So somewhere in the middle of my IVF cycle, I was told to add in Cetrotide, which is a different medication. They did give me, I think, an initial dose in that first shipment, now that I'm thinking about it. But yeah, Cetrotide I had to do both in the morning and in the evening, as opposed to all of my other medications, which were evening only. The Cetrotide did hurt. I was not a fan of the Cetrotide, but it was very similar to the Menopur. And actually, I'll kind of talk about these medications for a sec here. So the Gonal-F medication that I mentioned earlier came kind of already in a pen that you just had to kind of put a syringe on and then you could inject. The Menopur and the Cetrotide were separated with like the medication versus like I think they called it a diluent, just like the liquid that you would mix with the powder to make it injectable. The Menopur mixed really quickly. The Cetrotide took a little bit longer. And so it was always a little bit of a waiting game of like, you know, swirling it for like a minute or so to make sure it was fully dissolved. And again, those were the two that for me hurt the most. I don't know if most people have that experience, but again, those two were just less fun for me to inject. Not that stabbing yourself with needles is fun in any capacity. The later I got in my cycle, the closer my appointments got together. The first checkup I had after my injection started was like 5 days after. And then I think it went to like 3 days out and then 2 days out. And then I was coming in every day. At some point, you're likely going to be having appointments on the weekends. That's just how these clinics work. They're open for business and stuff like that. Now, just as a personal note, I had something big happen in my personal life during this. My grandmother passed away during my first IVF cycle. It wasn't unexpected. I actually made a point to go see her before my cycle started because I had a feeling that this may happen during my cycle, and I knew that I likely couldn't travel. But it being expected doesn't make it any less traumatic and sad. So when people ask me about side effects of the medications, if they may be more emotional or anything like that, like truly I cannot answer, because at least not based on that first IVF round, because I was a mess in kind of every capacity. And I think that was very normal for what I was going through. So when it was clear that she was going to be passing away, I did call my clinic and I asked, is there any way that I can go up and see her and just have a different clinic, do my check-in appointment? And they told me no. I don't know if it's common to be able to do that. I remember calling, I think, them one time and them kind of saying, if you're trying to come to us for one of those check-ins, press this number. So I feel like it is possible to go to another clinic for some of that. I don't know. I'm trying not to think about it too much, honestly, because if I could have seen her and they really unnecessarily stopped me from seeing her, that makes me really devastated. I haven't really thought about it much until now, actually. But yeah, it was a really hard time. It was a really hard time. I definitely remember having a very emotional conversation where me and I think the ultrasound tech were both crying, talking about it. But yeah, just not the best. Not the best. So from a physical standpoint, right before the transfer, I just remember feeling so full. The way that I describe it is that when you're pregnant, your belly grows, but it's hard, or at least it's firm, right? I felt like my stomach was full of jello, and it would just jiggle, and that in a very uncomfortable way. So if I was chasing my cats around the house or, running after my toddler, it was it was sloshing around, and it was a step behind whatever I was doing. So I was getting pulled in another direction. It was really weird. I was not a fan. The last 2 days or so of that IVF cycle, I just remember working from home in my bed all day because I just didn't even want to be standing up. And maybe that's a little dramatic. I absolutely could have just been on my feet all day. Since I didn't have to, I just laid there. In terms of getting ready for retrieval day, there was a few things that we needed to do. I had to remember to get a sample cup for my husband because he had to provide a semen sample, because they will go ahead and fertilize the eggs right after they retrieve them. One thing I was frustrated about with my clinic is they didn't remind you to do that. There was a little station right near the front desk where they would have them available, but sometimes they would run out throughout the day and you'd have to ask them hey, can I get a sample cup? But again, you have to remember to ask. And it was I just wish that they would kind of remind you of those things, especially if they know that you're close to transfer day. Sorry if I've been saying transfer, I mean retrieval. I'll try to edit that in because I don't know what I've already said earlier in the video. When retrieval day actually came, I was just so excited to be done with it all. So for me, when I got to retrieval day, I feel like most people are just excited that it's the next step in their fertility journey, or they're one step closer to having their kid. Because I was in such a weird emotional state, I was just glad to not be holding up a funeral anymore, because that was kind of what I was doing towards the end of that cycle. No one could plan anything because they didn't know exactly when I was going to be done with my retrieval and all this stuff. I'm pretty sure that my retrieval was on a Wednesday or a Thursday, and the funeral ended up being on a Sunday. And so basically when I got the call to say yep, you're going to trigger on this day, that was when we scheduled everything. So your egg retrieval is not just a quick office procedure. It actually is one that you get put under anesthesia for. You tend to have to take a full day off of work because you're recovering from coming out of that anesthesia. You may not feel great afterwards. So it is kind of a process. During my first egg retrieval, there was actually a fentanyl shortage, and fentanyl is typically what they use to help with the pain management during the procedure. I had to actually go pick up a narcotic and almost didn't get it in time. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't gotten it, but luckily we were able to kind of get it really quickly the night before. because I guess the pharmacy that I brought it to just didn't have it on hand right away when I first brought them the prescription. It was a whole mess. But yeah, so when egg retrieval day came along, I went in early in the morning with my husband. They get you kind of dressed up like you're going to surgery. Like you go in, like you put on a gown, you put on the little like hairnet and everything. They get an IV started for any medications that they're going to give you and things like that. And then they knock you out for, I think it's like 30 minutes or so. And then it's done. But you end up having to recover most of the day because they are putting you to sleep during the procedure. You have to have someone stay with you the whole time and then drive you home and things like that. So they are able to give you your results nearly immediately after the retrieval, which is great. So before I left the office, I knew that 21 eggs were retrieved. And I believe later that day, they let me know that 19 of those eggs were mature. I believe it was the following day they let me know that 16 of those eggs fertilized. And then it was kind of a waiting game to see which of those fertilized eggs would make it to the blastocyst phase. And that's when the embryo will contain 6 to 10 cells. It's wild to think that they're that small, but it's really, really cool. What my clinic told me was just hang out, we'll give you an update in about a week, and we'll let you know which ones you're gonna send off for testing. So again, this is where my experience may differ from someone else's, because we were going through the PGTA and PGTM testing. PGTA testing is what they use to detect your more common genetic abnormalities. So things like trisomy 13, Down syndrome, things like that. Whereas PGTM testing is where they're targeting specific genetic issues that you yourself have. And so because we were trying to avoid the muscular dystrophy gene, they were looking for the markers for that specific issue. We ended up having 8 of our eggs that made it to that blastocyst phase. I think that's actually pretty common for about half to reach it. And then those 8 were the eggs that we shipped off to testing. Our PGTM and PGTA testing was done through iGenomics. Now I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here about PGTM testing because I think it's really interesting. So when we were preparing for IVF, we had to get our own genetic testing done again to kind of reconfirm that yes, I do have the muscular dystrophy gene. And then they also tested my parents. Now, what I didn't realize until we went through this process is that they can't just probe the embryo and necessarily say like, yes, it has the gene. Like what they actually do is they map out your family's genes, like in my case, my mother's genes and my father's genes, my genes and my husband's genes. And because they knew that I was a carrier and they knew that my mom was a carrier, they're able to say this embryo looks like both Nikki and her mom, and therefore that embryo is likely to be a carrier, versus if it looks like Nikki and it looks like her dad, then it's not likely to be a carrier. And same with like my husband, if it looks more like my husband in that area, then it's likely to not be a carrier. It's super interesting. It's less like binary true or false than I expected. It makes sense that it's more of a science because obviously it is a science. Super interesting. But anyways, that testing is not super quick. It took about 3 weeks after we sent our embryos over to them. In that period of time, I had to go through and there was some confusion about whether my original IVF authorization through Progeny covered the genetic testing or not. So that was a little bit stressful. We almost didn't have our test results by the time that I was going to have my follow-up appointment. My doctor actually ended up delaying my appointment by like 30 minutes so that she could call and get our results from iGenomics. But it turns out that we ended up with 3 usable embryos, all of which are boys, which is really cool. Because we had kind of come to the conclusion that if we were not able to successfully, confirm that embryos were carriers or not, then we would just use only female embryos because they're much less likely to show signs of the disease. But the fact that we got not only any boys, but all boys was really interesting. The other just fun fact of it was that 7 of the 8 embryos that we sent off for testing were boys. So I don't know what happens just in life, but sometimes I think you just have weird patterns where things like that happen. I don't know. It was just meant to have boy embryos this time around, I guess. Now, because of our unique circumstances and the fact that we have insurance that covers IVF, we decided to pursue a second round of IVF before attempting an embryo transfer. that is going to be one of the next videos I film. So please keep an eye out for that video if that's interesting to you. I am going to go into how different of an experience it was. Luckily for me, it was much less emotional because I didn't have any deaths in the family or anything else kind of dramatic going on in my life at the time. I feel like I was a little bit more level-headed during that retrieval process. And then we're actually preparing for an embryo transfer right now. So that's also going to be an interesting experience, and I'm happy to share that with you guys as well if you're interested. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe because it helps my channel reach more people, and I will see you in my next one.